Hello friends, tonight we settle in with a subject that is at once scandalous and scholarly, the intimate, confusing, and occasionally downright bizarre world of medieval sex. It was an era of chivalry, yes, but also a time of deeply suspicious herbal remedies, where foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one else was watching. So, before you get too comfortable, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find peace and enjoyment in what I do here. And please, let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from across the globe. Now, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, rhythmic background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let us begin by dispelling the biggest misconception. Medieval intimacy did not unfold beneath silk sheets and candlelit chambers, while a lute played softly in the background. In reality, the setting was usually a small, single-room home shared by an entire family. This included children, aging relatives, a couple of goats, and perhaps a chicken who held very strong opinions about personal space. Privacy, as we think of it today, simply did not exist. Most peasants lived in homes where the kitchen, the bedroom, the stable were technically the same square footage, just separated by different smells. If a couple wanted a moment of alone time, they had to get creative. Timing mattered immensely, so did volume, and ideally, so did ensuring the children were asleep and facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury few could afford. Beds were shared. Even among the upper classes, servants might be asleep at the foot of the master's bed or standing quietly in the corner, pretending not to notice anything at all. Many noble households actually kept records of bedroom arrangements for legal or religious reasons, which is exactly as awkward as it sounds. Traveling offered no escape either. Inns often featured shared beds. Tightest right total strangers might sleep side by side for the night, which made things even more complicated. If you wanted a little affection, you had better check if there was already someone else in the bed, and whether or not they had remembered to remove their boots. If you were married and both parties were still awake and reasonably clean, you could share a mattress of straw and hope for the best. If you were not married, well, you had to be twice as quiet and 3 times as careful. Communities were incredibly small, walls were paper thin, and gossip traveled faster than plague rats. For those living in monasteries or convents, the rule was simple. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no late-night whispers. But even there, human nature occasionally made things complicated, which perhaps explains why so many abbeys were built with unusually high garden walls. In the medieval world, few things shaped private life more than the church, and the church had a lot to say about what went on behind closed doors, or more accurately, behind shared curtains. According to church teachings, physical intimacy had one primary function: making more people. That was it. Not pleasure, not bonding, not stress relief, ... just reproduction. Everything else was considered distracting at best and sinful at worst. This was not just material for the Sunday sermon. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions on what was and was not acceptable, just in case anyone dared to improvise. Certain days of the week were strictly off limits, so were major feast days, fasting days, holy days, and in some regions, entire liturgical seasons. Did you want to be close to your spouse during Lent? Think again. Advent. Also know that left, perhaps, Tuesdays in April. Even within marriage, there were heavy expectations. Couples were encouraged to approach one another with modesty and restraint. Expressions of affection were acceptable, but they must not be excessive. Displays of true passion were, to put it mildly, frowned upon. One 13th century guide actually suggested that married couples should engage in intimacy without pleasure, without sin, and without delay, which is, by all accounts, a fairly joyless checklist. The preferred method was the missionary position, and not just for religious symbolism. It was deemed the most natural, and therefore the least likely to offend God, the saints, or your local priest. Anything else was considered suspect. That includes things like enthusiasm. Confession also got involved in the bedroom. Priests often asked pointed questions during confession to determine whether couples had broken any moral or ecclesiastical guidelines. These were not vague spiritual inquiries. They were very specific, sometimes uncomfortably so. Let us just say the average 14th century friar knew far more about his parishioners' bedrooms than their birthdays. Still, enforcement was uneven. Some regions were stricter than others. Some priests ignored these rules entirely, and many lay people, particularly the peasants, simply smiled, nodded, and did exactly what they were going to do anyway, just quietly. If you think modern couples have trouble syncing their schedules, spare a thought for the medieval folks. Planning a romantic evening in the Middle Ages required a calendar, a priest's blessing, and the luck of St. Valentine himself, who, ironically, was never married. The church had opinions, and by opinions, we mean strict prohibitions on when intimacy was allowed. Sundays? Absolutely not. That was the Lord's Day. Fridays? Still no, a day of penance. Wednesdays? Suspicious. Add in Lent, which is 40 days. Advent? Another 40. Various saints, feast days, holy days, fast days, and even certain phases of the moon. And you will find the calendar was less of a schedule and more of a divine obstacle course. The idea was to keep the soul focused on heaven, even when the body had other ideas. There were even written lists of forbidden days. Some confession manuals outlined nearly half the year as off-limits. And if you were feeling particularly affectionate during one of those forbidden days, well, enjoy your spiritual guilt and an extra trip to confession. One 13th century bishop famously scolded a married couple for their excessive affection, which translated to being intimate more than once a month. He recommended they direct their passion toward prayer instead. The couple was reportedly not thrilled. Naturally, the upper classes were more exposed to these restrictions. They had chaplains, confessors, and spiritual advisors breathing down their necks constantly. Peasants, meanwhile, had a more flexible approach. Their lives revolved around livestock, the weather, and simply not freezing to death, which left less time for worrying about whether Tuesday was the feast of St. Nun. To make things worse, some believed that intimacy during the wrong time could result in sickly children, divine punishment, or, worst of all, a reputation. If your neighbors caught wind that you were celebrating a little too enthusiastically during Lent, it could lead to shame, intense gossip, or a strongly worded sermon delivered with maximum eye contact. Romance in medieval Europe was less about falling in love and more about falling into a legally binding agreement. If you were hoping for candlelit dinners, poetry, and whispered confessions, you would be better off reading a troubadour ballad. Real-life courtship for most people involved livestock, land rights, and two families agreeing not to start a feud. Marriage was primarily a business deal. Daughters were exchanged to cement alliances, acquire property, or secure peace between neighbors who had previously disagreed over whose pig ate whose cabbage. A bride might come with a dowry of coin, linens, or a small patch of farmland. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be entirely insufferable. Courtship, when it did happen, was supervised, sometimes literally. Young people rarely caught a moment alone. A maiden might be watched over by her mother, a stern aunt, or, if things got really serious, an entire village that was very invested in whether or not you held hands. Among the nobility, arranged matches were the norm. Kings and lords negotiated marriages like chess moves, and affection was something you developed later. Or not at all. One medieval proverb more or less stated, "Better a wealthy match with a grumpy face than a poor one with dimples." Romantic, isn't it? Even among peasants, practical concerns ruled the day. A man's suitability was judged by his land, his tools, or the size of his ox. And women, they were evaluated on their housekeeping skills, reputation, and general ability to not start drama at the market. This does not mean love didn't exist. It did, but it usually came after marriage, not before. If affection grew over time, that was considered a bonus, not a requirement. Think of it like medieval emotional DLC, not included in the base marriage package. Still, where there is a will, there is a workaround. Secret flirtations, playful songs, and moonlit walks to the village well became the unsanctioned side quests of medieval dating. Just be careful. Get caught kissing behind the barn and you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father holding a pitchfork. Finally, let us clear up one of the most persistent legends about medieval relationships: chastity belts. Yes, you've probably seen them in cartoons, in high drama, historical movies, or perhaps in the dusty corners of very unfortunate museum gift shops. I am speaking, of course, of those heavy iron contraptions allegedly locked around a woman's waist while her husband went off to war, supposedly leaving her physically and morally sealed against the world. Sad? Not really. There is actually no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were ever widely used in the Middle Ages. In fact, most examples we see in museums today actually come from the Renaissance, or even the Victorian era periods that were far more obsessed with the idea of medieval repression than with what actually happened during the time. Many of these belts were likely created as joke items, artistic warnings about fidelity, or strange museum curiosities, rather than functioning devices. Medieval manuscripts, which often record all sorts of uncomfortable and intimate details, are suspiciously silent about any mass distribution of iron belts. No tailor advertised them. No laws regulated them. No churches handed them out during awkward marriage ceremonies. It is almost as if, and stay with me here, they were not actually a thing. And this makes perfect sense because the design is wildly impractical. Medieval hygiene was already questionable at best. Now, imagine adding a rusty metal contraption with no user manual and a padlock that probably required a blacksmith to operate. It would have caused far more infections than it prevented indiscretions. So, where did the myth come from? Likely from a combination of later moral panic and satire. Renaissance moralists and Victorian collectors simply loved the image of a repressed, over-controlled medieval woman. It fit their narrative of the Dark Ages, and nothing says virtue quite like a literal keyhole in your underpants. In reality, fidelity was enforced through more traditional and, frankly, more effective means: shame, surveillance, religion, and strategic matchmaking. Noble women were often chaperoned within an inch of their lives. Peasant girls had entire villages watching them like unpaid private investigators, and any slight whiff of scandal could lead to ruined reputations. Lost dowries, or awkward confessions involving phrases like "at the edge of the barley field," in a surprising twist that would likely shock many of their modern descendants. Medieval towns did not just tolerate brothels. In many cases, they regulated them. That is right. In several parts of medieval Europe, especially in the bustling urban centers, brothels operated as fully legal businesses. Town councils licensed them, charged taxes on them, and even designated specific red light districts long before the light bulb was actually invented. Some cities went as far as employing officials to manage them. These lucky souls were known as brothel keepers, or, more colorfully, keepers of public women, which sounds like a very stressful line on a professional resume. The rationale behind this arrangement was pragmatic, if a little cynical. Officials believed that allowing a controlled outlet for men's desires would reduce the chances of greater sins like adultery, assault, or heaven forbid dancing. Regulated brothels were seen as a necessary evil to keep society orderly, much like traffic signs or the existence of turnips. The church, of course, was not thrilled. Officially, it condemned the entire practice, but unofficially, many clergy turned a blind eye. Some even collected rent from the very same establishments they preached against. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You have grasped the essence of medieval theology and practice. Working in a brothel was no fairy tale, but it was not necessarily a life of constant misery either. Some women chose the profession for purely economic reasons, especially widows or those without family support. Others were coerced or trafficked, particularly in port cities where sailors brought in coin and complications in equal measure. There were even handbooks, actual handbooks for how these houses should be managed. Clean sheets, basic health inspections, and set hours were all part of the regulation process. Patrons came from all social classes: knights, apprentices, merchants, and even monks, despite vows that strongly suggested otherwise. Entry fees varied, services were cataloged, and in some cases, customers paid in eggs, wool, or whatever awkward barter item they had on hand. Medieval tinder, it was not. Let us set the scene. Candlelight is flickering. A soft breeze blows through the thatched roof. Your beloved whispers sweet nothings, and then removes their heavy wool tunic to reveal a powerful medieval musk. Because when it came to personal hygiene, medieval Europe had priorities. Staying clean was on the list, certainly, but it was usually somewhere after surviving the plague. It's fixing the leaking roof and catching the pig that got into the pantry again. Bathing did happen, but not nearly as often as modern noses would hope. Peasants bathed infrequently, perhaps once a month, or more if they fell into a river by accident. Soap was either homemade or imported, which made it expensive and used sparingly. And while public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, they were sometimes banned during outbreaks of disease or scandal, or both. If you were wealthy, you had options. A hot bath could be drawn, scented with herbs, and followed by being rubbed with linen cloths by attendants. If you were poor, your sponge bath involved a cold bucket in the vague hope that nobody would notice your aroma over the smell of the stables. To add complexity, water itself was occasionally viewed with suspicion, especially cold water. Some believed bathing too frequently could weaken the body or open the pores to illness. Others simply didn't have the time or the tub or any water that wasn't already being fought over by the local geese. Now, imagine trying to impress someone under these conditions. Perfume was mostly for the elite. Deodorant was a dream of the distant future. Dental care, well, you might rub your teeth with ash or chew mint leaves if you were feeling fancy. Kissing was certainly an adventure. Clothing didn't help either. Layers of wool, leather, linen, and fur trapped heat, sweat, and every scent you encountered during your day, including the contents of the chamber pot and the mystery stew. And yet, people still found ways to fall in love, flirt, and get close. Camps, our standards were different. Craps, when everyone smelled equally awful. Love was truly blind, and nose blind. In medieval Europe, controlling the size of your family was a bit like trying to steer a cart with no wheels, no reins, and a particularly uncooperative goat. Technically possible, but not something you could count on. To be clear, people did try. Just because contraception wasn't effective by modern standards didn't mean medieval folks were oblivious. They were very much aware that certain behaviors led to babies, and many went to elaborate, if occasionally baffling, lengths to prevent it. Some of the more scientific methods included herbal mixtures, animal membranes, and rituals that involved burying certain objects near the doorstep. One popular approach advised drinking wine boiled with beaver testicles. Others recommended wearing amulets blessed by someone who hopefully wasn't just guessing. A few guides even claimed jumping up and down vigorously after intimacy would help, which, if nothing else, probably burned some calories. There were also early versions of barrier methods, though calling them reliable would be generous. Linen soaked in various concoctions was one approach. A few brave souls tried wax, and there are scattered references to, let's call them, medieval prototypes for what would later become familiar latex devices. but do not ask how they were made. You really do not want to know. The church, of course, was not amused. Any attempt to avoid conception was often labeled sinful or unnatural. Procreation was the stated goal of marriage, and anything that got in the way of that divine mission was frowned upon, or, more commonly, denounced loudly from the pulpit. Still, not everyone followed church guidance. Among married couples, particularly those struggling with poverty, the desire to space out pregnancies or avoid another mouth to feed was very real. And among unmarried couples, let's just say the motivation was even stronger. But no matter the method, reliability was low. Birth control, such as it was, depended on folk wisdom, local herbs, and a surprising amount of hope. And when it failed, which it often did well, that is where hasty marriages, hidden pregnancies, and a lot of awkward conversations came in. Despite what church authorities liked to pretend, not every medieval couple waited until the wedding bells rang before getting cozy. In fact, the practice of testing the goods before marriage was, well, common enough to require a lot of paperwork. It was known as fornication in church records and getting ahead of yourself in everyday village gossip. Intimacy before marriage wasn't exactly rare, but it was definitely monitored. In towns and parishes across Europe, local officials kept moral rolls, which were less like diaries and more like ledgers of shame. If a couple was caught, or even suspected of jumping the marital timeline, they could be hauled before the local court and fined. Sometimes the fine found its way into the coffers of the church. Sometimes it went to the town council. And occasionally, quite strangely, it went to the very person who claimed to have witnessed the event in the first place. Indeed, the medieval practice of informing on one's neighbors, what we might call snitching, was alive, well, and occasionally profitable. These fines varied, of course. The cost of indiscretion depended on whether it was a first offense, whether a pregnancy had resulted from the tryst, or whether the couple eventually decided to get married. In some cases, getting married after the fact effectively erased the fine entirely. It was, in a sense, a form of retroactive permission. In other instances, the fine was still applied, but at a discounted rate. Think of it as an early bird penalty for those who had jumped the gun. And let us not forget the social consequences. In these tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. Privacy was a myth. So even if your local priest was feeling merciful that week, your neighbors likely were not. Gossip could spread through a village faster than a poorly stored meat pie in the heat of July. Interestingly, many of these situations resulted in a practice known as hand fasting. This was a sort of informal engagement, a promise where the couple considered themselves betrothed. In some regions, this promise alone was legally enough to begin cohabiting. The church, ever concerned with order, later tried to tighten that loophole, But in the meantime, a great many medieval babies were, technically speaking, early arrivals, Among the peasantry, this was all handled with a bit more practicality. If a couple was clearly serious about one another and a pregnancy had occurred, marriage usually followed, sometimes hurried along with a gentle nudge or perhaps a firm push from both families. Among the nobles, however, the consequences could be far more severe, especially if inheritance, lineage, or a pristine reputation was on the line. In the medieval world, you see, virginity was not merely a virtue. It was a contract clause, a political tool, and occasionally a community-wide obsession. Among the peasantry, expectations varied by region and circumstance. A young woman was generally expected to arrive at her marriage untested, at least officially. But if she did not, some eyebrows would rise. Perhaps a small fine would be levied, or a shotgun wedding might sort things out without too much fuss. For the upper classes, though, things got serious. A noble woman's virginity was directly tied to inheritance, to alliances, and to family honor. A broken engagement might spark a feud that lasted for years. A pregnancy out of wedlock could derail generations of careful planning. So, how did they verify it? Well, badly. Sometimes, it simply came down to vague testimony and character references. Did she seem virtuous? Did she avoid the stable boy most of the time? That was often enough. Other times, however, more invasive and unfortunate methods were used, such as midwives or matrons inspecting for the infamous hymen witch. As modern science has since confirmed, is not, in fact, a reliable medieval chastity barometer. But that scientific reality did not stop anyone back then. There were also attempts to prove virginity after the wedding had taken place, such as the tradition of displaying a blood-stained sheet the morning after. It was like a very awkward, very public medieval review system. This tradition, while not universal, was expected in certain regions, and if the sheet stayed clean, cue the lawsuits, the annulments, and family drama on a scale rivaling the most intense royal soap operas. Men, of course, were under no such scrutiny. Male virginity was considered an optional bonus, if it was considered at all. A future husband's experience level was rarely questioned. At most, he might be encouraged to avoid tavern maids or loose company, but rest assured, no one was checking his laundry the next morning. Virginity was also deeply linked to religious symbolism. Maidens were often praised as pure vessels, which is a beautiful concept in theory, but incredibly uncomfortable in practice. Young girls were raised with saintly ideals, often featuring horrifying martyrdom stories as examples to live by. And if a marriage was annulled on the grounds that a bride had been dishonest about her past, it did not just ruin her. It could drag down her entire family's honor and threaten their property claims. So yes, in medieval Europe, virginity was not just about morality. It was legal currency, right? If you were wondering whether same-sex attraction existed in medieval times, the answer is a resounding yes. Human nature, after all, did not begin in the 20th century. But if you were wondering whether it was openly accepted, that is where things get complicated. Medieval society was structured entirely around religious doctrine, rigid social roles, and property rights. And all three of these pillars had a lot to say about who could love whom. Spoiler alert, it was usually a man and a woman within marriage, preferably for the sole purpose of making more villagers. Officially, same-sex intimacy was labeled a sin by the church, often lumped in with other unnatural acts, a category that could sometimes include things like dancing on feast days or reading too many books. Punishments varied wildly depending on the region, the time period, and exactly who was involved. A peasant couple might get a scolding and some penance. Nobles, they might face exile, or, if they had enough land and influence, they might simply be quietly ignored. But while the church thundered from the pulpit, real life was always messier and more human. We have records, poems, letters, and even legal documents that show emotional, romantic, and sometimes physical relationships between people of the same sex. Some monks wrote love letters to each other in Latin that sound suspiciously less brotherly and far more longing. Noblewomen sometimes shared beds and declared exclusive devotion to one another in terms that would make a troubadour blush. Medieval Europe also had social structures that blurred these lines. Mild monasteries and all-female convents created environments for deep emotional bonds. Knightly brotherhoods were full of vows and affectionate language. Some historians debate endlessly whether these bonds were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, there were deep feelings involved, and quite possibly poetry. As for terminology, the modern concept of sexual identity simply did not exist. You did not come out. You just lived carefully, quietly, and often coded in allegory. There were no pride parades, but there were songs, stories of paired saints, and suspiciously intense pilgrimages taken in pairs. Adultery in medieval Europe was a bit like handling a live chicken while juggling knives, risky, loud, and likely to end with someone losing a bit of pride, or perhaps some property. Let us be clear, adultery was not viewed just as a personal failing. It was a social offense. Marriage was seen not only as a holy sacrament, but also as a legal contract, a property deal, and often a strategic alliance. So, when someone strayed, they were not just breaking hearts, okay? They were tampering with inheritances, dowries, and the always fragile equilibrium of local gossip. For women, the stakes were significantly higher. A married woman caught in an affair could face public shaming, the loss of her dowry rights, forced penance, or even exiles, especially if she had the audacity to get caught with evidence. Adulterous noblewomen might find themselves imprisoned, divorced, or, in extreme cases, discreetly removed from court life altogether. Think less scarlet letter and more scarlet exit. Men, on the other hand, got more leeway. A married man having an affair with an unmarried woman might be seen as morally suspect, but he was rarely legally punished, unless the woman's family had powerful friends or the church was feeling unusually righteous that week. That said, not all adulterers got off easy. Some towns imposed steep fines or required public confession. A few legal records include creative punishments, such as parading the offender through the village in nothing but a shift, or forcing them to pay for a new church bell, because nothing says divine justice quite like bronze acoustics ringing out over the town. The real danger, however, was not always the law, was the husband. Cuckolds were not unheard of, particularly among the nobles. If a cuckolded man discovered his wife's affair, medieval customs sometimes allowed him to take appropriate action. The definition of appropriate, of course, depended heavily on his status, his temper, and how many swords he owned. For the wealthy, things could spiral into full-blown scandals, duels, annulments, or decades-long family feuds. For peasants, the consequences were usually financial: pine here, a goat forfeited there, and a permanent place in the village gossip chain. In medieval Europe, the idea of consent existed, but not in the way we understand it today. It was not about mutual respect or enthusiastic yeses. Instead, it was tangled in law codes, dowries, church doctrine, and the occasional indifferent shrug from society. Let us start with the basics. Medieval canon law did recognize the concept of consent in marriage. In fact, a marriage was considered valid if both parties verbally consented, even without a priest present. That is right. Two people saying, "I will," in a field somewhere could, technically, be married. Romantic. Possibly. Legally confusing. Absolutely. But here is the rub. Just because consent was acknowledged in theory does not mean it was respected in practice, especially for women. For noble daughters, consent often came after the arrangements were made. Families negotiated marriages like peace treaties. The young lady's opinion might be politely requested or strongly implied, but in the end, the dowry talked much louder than she did. For peasant women, choices were broader, but still pressured. Saying no to a match could mean economic ruin or social backlash, and saying no to the local reeve's son, that was riskier still. Inside marriage, the concept of consent became even murkier. Husbands held legal rights to their wives' bodies, and for a wife to deny him could be grounds for a formal complaint, or even an annulment. Some church thinkers of the time argued that spouses owed each other the marital debt. Now, this sounds like a joint checking account, but in practice, it was far less voluntary. Still, the picture was not entirely grim. Medieval courts did prosecute cases of coercion and assault, especially when witnesses were available or when the accused did not have powerful friends to shield them. In bustling urban centers like London or Paris, court records show both women and men bringing forward complaints, sometimes winning justice, or at the very least, making a public stink about their mistreatment. And let us not forget the literary side of things. Medieval tales are absolutely full of complex dynamics. Courtly love poetry, for example, often danced around the idea of consent, with knights pining away, ladies refusing their advances, and everyone dramatically swooning. If nothing else, These stories suggest they knew it was important to ask, even if, in reality, they often ignored the answer. If you have ever felt like the medieval church had a complicated relationship with physical pleasure, you are absolutely right. It wasn't just complicated. It was borderline suspicious. And that suspicion extended right into the bedroom of every married couple, where the church preferred to dearly that nothing too enjoyable was going on. To be fair, the church did not outright ban marital relations. That would have been a logistical nightmare for inheritance, population growth, and, well, the future of humanity. But it did strongly recommend moderation, extreme moderation, like once a month, in the dark, with no smiling kind of moderation. Theologians of the time praised celibacy as the highest form of spiritual discipline. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows of celibacy. Even married couples were encouraged to live in continence, abstaining entirely, especially if they were older, holier, or simply tired of each other. A couple who voluntarily gave up intimacy was praised as being halfway to sainthood, or at least halfway to separate beds. Some church thinkers, like St. Jerome, went even further. He argued that even within marriage, desire itself was a weakness. Marital relations were acceptable only for procreation, not for fun, not for bonding, and certainly not because someone looked particularly fetching in their woolen nightshirt. This attitude filtered down into the confessionals and moral manuals. Priests were instructed to ask married parishioners if they had been too lustful, even with their own spouses. Picture, if you will, the profound and awkward silence that must have followed that question at the altar rail. And yet, people still lived their lives. Most peasants, merchants, and even nobles nodded politely at the church's teachings, and then went home and did whatever felt right between their chores, their taxes, and the odd peasant uprising. Let's be honest, after a long day of threshing barley or settling land disputes, a little affection probably felt more comforting than shameful. But for the truly devout, celibate marriages were held up as the ultimate models of spiritual partnership. These were couples who lived together, prayed together, and considered carnal urges a thing of the past, or at least a thing better left to the younger, less holy villagers. After everything we have covered tonight: arranged marriages, fines for flirting, herbal birth control, suspicious bath habits, and church warnings against smiling too much, you might be wondering, did medieval people actually fall in love? The answer is yes, awkwardly, passionately, and sometimes even happily. Despite the rigid social structures and the moral sermons, love found a way to bloom in the cracks. Peasant couples courted in the open fields and marketplaces, trading favors, flowers, and whispered gossip over the turnips. Noble lovers exchanged poetry and secret glances during formal banquets, all while pretending to care deeply about hunting falcon breeds. Monks and nuns wrote letters filled with an intensity of emotion that modern readers still debate. Today, was it spiritual longing or something more? The literature from the period is bursting with romance. Troubadours sang of distant ladies who inspired knights to go off and get very dramatically injured in their honor. Stories of courtly love glorified longing from afar, especially if you were pining for someone married to your boss. Sure, the love was often unattainable, but hey, that is where the best verses come from. In some cases, couples genuinely married for love. Records survive of peasants who eloped or refused matches arranged by their parents. Even nobles occasionally rebelled, much to the horror of their family accountants. The church, interestingly enough, actually required verbal consent from both the bride and the groom, even if that consent was delivered through gritted teeth while holding a goose as dowry collateral. And once married, many couples built strong, enduring partnerships. They worked side by side, raised children, endured plagues, and navigated taxes, which is basically the medieval version of a romantic getaway. Letters between spouses, especially during times of separation, show real affection, real longing, and real commitment. Even widows and widowers sometimes remarried for companionship rather than political gain, choosing someone they simply liked to spend their remaining years with. 'Cause even after everything, the rules, the risks, the rituals, people still wanted to feel loved, preferably before curfew, and hopefully not during Lent. Now, let us turn the page of history to a different time and a different kind of resilience. It all began with a disaster. Zeno of Citium, a wealthy merchant from the island of Cyprus, had it all. Ships loaded with precious dyes, trade routes mapped across the glistening Mediterranean, and the kind of fortune that made a man feel invincible. But fate, as ancient philosophers love to remind us, does not care how many ships you own. Somewhere near Athens, Zeno's fleet was caught in a violent storm. The sea didn't just swallow his cargo, swallowed his identity. One moment he was a merchant, the next a man with nothing. When he finally washed up on the Athenian shore, he was broke, soaked, and ironically on the verge of discovering something far more enduring than trade wealth. Nowhere to go and nothing left to lose, Zeno wandered into a small bookshop in the Athenian agora. It was here that he picked up a worn copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a text that preserved the wisdom of Socrates. Intrigued by the quiet power of the ideas within, Zeno asked the bookseller where he could find a man like Socrates today. The bookseller simply pointed to a stooped, cranky philosopher named Crates walking by. And so, Zeno began studying under Crates, the cynic, a man known for rejecting wealth and possessions with almost theatrical dedication. He once threw his money into the sea just to prove a point. At first, Zeno struggled with this extreme lifestyle. He wasn't quite ready to live in poverty for philosophy's sake, but Crates planted a seed in his mind, one that grew into a new way of thinking. Zeno didn't stay a student forever. Over time, he pieced together his own worldview, borrowing Socratic ethics, cynic discipline, and the logical rigor of earlier thinkers like Heraclitus. Eventually, he began teaching in the painted colonnade of Athens, the Stoa Poikila, public porch decorated with murals. That is where Stoicism got its name. Not from an ivory tower or a secret academy, but from a painted porch open to all. It is a fitting origin, a philosophy born not from luxury, but from ruin. Not in a palace, but in a moment of humility. Stoicism, from its very first breath, was designed to help people navigate the wreckage, not avoid it. And Zeno was its first survivor. After the shipwreck and the scrolls, after the quiet conversations with cynics and the long walks under the Athenian sun, Zeno didn't just start teaching, started redefining what it meant to live well. At the heart of his philosophy was one powerful idea, logos. To the Stoics, logos wasn't just reason. It was the divine, rational structure of the universe, the cosmic blueprint. Everything, they believed, happened for a reason, whether or not humans could understand it. The world, messy as it seemed, was ordered. And if you could align your thinking with that cosmic order, you could live with peace, clarity, and moral strength. Zeno and his early followers taught that virtuosity in Greek was the only true good, not fame, not wealth, not even physical health. Those were indifferents, things that might be nice to have, but didn't define your moral worth. What mattered was how you handled them, and that is where the Stoic mindset takes shape. The world throws chaos at you, but you remain unmoved. Not emotionless, but anchored. You cannot control external events. You cannot control what people say or do, but you can always control your thoughts, your actions, and your responses. It was radical. Most people back then, and let's be honest, most people today's comfort, admiration, money, or control. The Stoicism offered a quieter path. Live in harmony with nature, accept fate without resentment, and strive only to be good, not to feel good. Their favorite analogy was this: life is like being a dog tied to a moving cart. You can either run with it or be dragged behind it. Either way, the cart is going forward. Your choice is simply how you move with it. Zeno wasn't alone for long. Students began gathering in the Stoa, discussing how to master themselves rather than the world. Over time, this porch talk turned into one of the most quietly resilient philosophies in history, a way of thinking that would outlast empires and endure through the collapse of civilizations. But philosophy, as we know, does not live in theory. It lives in practice, and in the next generation, a new Stoic would take the reins, one who fought his battles not with logic alone, but with discipline and steel. His name was Cleanthes, a former boxer who brought true muscle to the mind. Cleanthes was not your typical philosopher before he ever scribbled a single scroll or stood thoughtfully beneath the painted porch. He was a pugilist, earning his bread through sheer physical strength and relentless endurance in the ring. But when he discovered Zeno's teachings, he found a different kind of strength, the kind that didn't bruise the skin, but braced the soul. He was a man of humble means. He worked by night, carrying heavy water for a gardener to earn a meager wage, and he studied philosophy by day. His hands were calloused, his muscles worn from labor, but his mind was unshakable. Cleanthes embodied the core Stoic belief that virtue comes not from privilege or leisure, but from perseverance. He didn't speak of theories he hadn't tested. If Zeno taught that one should accept hardship with grace, Cleanthes lived that truth with every sunrise. His most famous work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a poetic tribute to the logos, that divine rationality that governs all things. But do not let the title fool you. This wasn't religious flattery or superstition. It was a calm, reasoned declaration of cosmic order. Everything Cleanthes wrote is woven into a grand plan, even the painful parts, even the struggles. His brand of Stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and impossible to move. He also introduced a more emotional texture to the philosophy. While Zeno emphasized logic and cool detachment, Cleanthes suggested that proper emotions, like awe at the beauty of nature or a deep love for wisdom, could have a place, provided they aligned with reason. He wasn't arguing for indulgence, just for balance. After all, what good is a philosophy that turns you into a robot? Cleanthes wasn't flashy, and he certainly didn't gather crowds with clever wordplay. In fact, some mocked him for being slow of speech. But what he lacked in eloquence, he made up for in steadiness. And in Stoicism, steadiness was everything. He eventually succeeded Zeno as the head of the Stoic school, not because he was the most charismatic man in Athens, but because he lived the philosophy more fully than anyone else. His life was a kind of walking proof, a quiet testament that one could endure hardship without bitterness, question fate without rage, and remain grounded without ever giving up on greatness. Through Cleanthes, Stoicism gained muscle. Not the kind that wins applause in the arena, but the kind that holds your spine straight when the world goes sideways. And then came a man who sharpened Stoicism like a blade, Chrysippus, the logician who turned this porch-born philosophy into a towering system of thought. If Zeno founded Stoicism, and Cleanthes gave it strength, Chrysippus gave it its skeleton. Without him, Stoicism might have crumbled into vague ideas and forgotten porch lectures. Instead, it became one of the most rigorous philosophical systems in the ancient world, thanks to a man who reportedly wrote over 700 books. Most of them are now lost to the sands of time, but their influence is undeniable. Chrysippus was relentless. He didn't just inherit the school from Cleanthes, he rebuilt it. Where Zeno had been reserved and Cleanthes poetic, Chrysippus was surgical. His specialty was logic. In a time when most philosophers leaned on rhetoric or emotional appeal, Chrysippus built a system of reasoning that could rival Aristotle's. He was obsessed with clarity. He believed that if Stoicism was to survive the ages, it couldn't rely on charisma or tradition alone. It had to make sense. It had to be ironclad, no loopholes, no fluff. He refined the Stoic distinction between what is in our control and what is not. Expanded their ethics, metaphysics, and physics into something coherent and unapologetically difficult. Chrysippus argued that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, not virtue plus comfort or virtue plus friends. Virtue, full stop. One of his most famous contributions was the lectum, a concept describing the meaning behind words. He argued that every spoken word had a sayable, a layer of content carried by speech, tied deeply to logic. It might sound abstract to us now, but this deepened the Stoic understanding of reason and clarity, which, for them, was essential to living a good life. But he wasn't just dry parchment and dusty scrolls. Chrysippus had a biting wit. Once, when accused of not practicing exactly what he preached, he supposedly replied, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick? He still knows how to treat illness." Stoicism, he reminded them, wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about trying every single day to close the gap between your actions and your ideals. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism hardened. It became more than just a comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic boxers. It became a discipline, something you studied, practiced, and used to cut through the confusion and chaos of the world. And that discipline would soon find its way out of Greece and into the beating heart of Rome, where emperors and slaves alike would grapple with its power. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of refinement. But in the hands of the Romans, it evolved from a Greek intellectual pursuit into a practical way of life, suited for statesmen, generals, and even emperors. The Romans weren't particularly interested in abstract metaphysics or syllogisms about the lecton. They wanted practicality. They faced wars, conspiracies, betrayal, and personal ruin on a grand scale. And they needed a system that could hold their inner world steady while the outer world collapsed around them. Stoicism, with its laser focus on self-mastery and virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect fit. Enter Seneca, the younger, philosopher, playwright, and the reluctant advisor to the notoriously unstable Emperor Nero. Seneca wasn't born into hardship. He was a wealthy member of the elite, well-educated, and dangerously close to power. But despite his high position, his writings reveal a man deeply aware of life's fragility and the corrupting lure of comfort. In his famous letters to Lucilius, Seneca preached restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against being ruled by emotion or desire. And yet, his own life was a constant battlefield between Stoic ideals and political compromise. He amassed wealth even as he wrote about frugality. He served a tyrant even while writing about virtue. But rather than discredit him, this tension makes him all the more relatable. Seneca didn't pose as a saint. He was painfully aware of his own contradictions. His advice to others often came with a quiet self-rebuke. "I am not a wise man," he wrote, "but a lover of wisdom." And maybe that is the most Stoic thing of all. Not to claim mastery, but to pursue it humbly, despite our flaws. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, another Roman gave it to everyone else. Epictetus, a former slave, crippled and impoverished. Epictetus owned nothing technically, not even himself, for much of his life. And yet, he taught that true freedom comes entirely from within. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." To him, life's hardships weren't obstacles to be feared. They were training grounds for virtue. His teachings, preserved by his student Arian, became a user's manual for inner liberation. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just philosophy. It was mental armor against a brutal world. And soon, that armor would be worn by the man who ruled the known world, Marcus Aurelius, emperor, warrior, and the most unlikely figure of Allah, philosopher king. It is one thing to read philosophy in peace, in a quiet library or a garden. It is another thing entirely to write it on the front lines of war, while ruling an empire that is crumbling at its edges. Marcus Aurelius, crowned emperor of Rome in 161 CE, was a man born into unimaginable privilege, and yet his reign was anything but comfortable. Plagues swept across the empire, decimating the population. Germanic tribes pushed relentlessly at the borders. His conqueror, Lucius Verus, died early. His generals betrayed him. And worst of all, his own son, Commodus, would grow into the very tyrant he had hoped never to raise. Amid all this chaos, Marcus didn't write speeches or propaganda. He wrote to himself, quiet personal reflections that were later compiled into the Meditations. Never intended for publication, these pages offer a rare window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like whispered reminders from a tired man trying desperately to stay upright. Begin each day by telling yourself, he wrote, today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. Now, that might sound like a terrible way to start a morning, but for Marcus Aurelius, that wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. It was armor, Marcus believed that by expecting hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. To him, people's difficult actions were not insults to be taken personally. They were merely reflections of their own ignorance, and his duty, he reminded himself, was not to control others, but to control himself. He often wrote to himself, you could die tomorrow. You could die today. So act now, not with anxiety, but with purpose. That wasn't despair. That was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire that stretched from the sands of Syria to the mists of Scotland, Marcus was obsessed with the inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos, by war, by plague, by politics, and still remain untouched, provided your mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected the opulence that usually came with the throne, And while he couldn't always live up to the perfect Stoic ideals, because who could, he returned to them like a compass in a storm. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but in many ways, he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in painted porches or ascetic monks hiding in caves. It was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, who wanted to carry a little bit of peace into the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It wouldn't vanish, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of calm in the modern world. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Stoicism didn't exactly die, but it faded. The philosophy that had once stood at the very heart of Roman intellectual life began to slip quietly into the background. Part of this had to do with politics. Marcus's son, Commodus, inherited the empire and seemed determined to undo every single Stoic virtue his father had lived by. While Marcus embodied restraint and wisdom, Commodus embodied indulgence and vanity. The Roman court became a theater of excess, and philosophy had no role in that spectacle. Meanwhile, a new force was rising, Christianity, as it spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became the state religion. Its theology, its rituals, and its worldview began to replace the ancient schools. Where Stoicism taught self-reliance, Christianity emphasized divine grace. Where Stoicism taught the acceptance of fate, Christianity spoke of redemption and the will of God, though these ideas weren't always in direct conflict. Christian thinkers often saw Stoicism as a noble, but ultimately pagan system, immoral, yet incomplete. And yet, Stoicism didn't vanish. It simply migrated. Its core ideas seeped quietly into early Christian thought. Many church fathers actually admired the Stoics. Thinkers like Augustine, though critical of Stoic pride, deeply respected their moral seriousness. Hence, the monastic traditions, especially among Christian ascetics, borrowed heavily from Stoic discipline, silence, simplicity, the denial of luxury, and the constant examination of one's conscience. All of these practices would have felt right at home in the writings of Epictetus or Seneca. Throughout the medieval period, Stoicism became a sort of background philosophy. It was respected by scholars, cited by monks, but rarely practiced in full. It was no longer a public movement or a street-side school. It was a whisper in the margins, kept alive by scribes, theologians, and the occasional curious mind. But survival is sometimes stronger than success. Stoicism, its quiet endurance, meant that when the intellectual winds shifted centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas would be ready to return. For all its decline, Stoicism had left seeds buried deep in the soil of Western thought. And when people once again sought clarity, purpose, and strength without illusion, those seeds would bloom, and one day they would even show up in places no ancient philosopher could have ever imagined. In self-help books, in leadership seminars, and yes, on your favorite podcast. Stoicism's comeback didn't arrive with a scroll in hand. It came through blogs, books, and digital audio. After centuries of quiet influence, the ancient philosophy found itself suddenly reborn in the digital age, repackaged for a world buzzing with distractions, anxieties, and a pressure to constantly optimize everything. In the 20th century, philosophers like Pierre Hadot had begun peeling back the layers of Stoicism, reminding readers that it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a way of life, not cold, but contemplative, not harsh, but healing. Hadot argued that ancient philosophy was originally a spiritual practice, and Stoicism, more than any other school, was meant to be lived, not merely read. That message hit home for a new generation. In the early 2000s, authors like Ryan Holiday helped usher Stoicism into the mainstream with accessible books like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy. Drawing on Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, Holiday framed Stoicism as a practical toolkit for resilience. It became something you could use whether you were launching a startup, coaching a sports team, or just trying to survive a bad Monday. Tech leaders and entrepreneurs soon latched on. Tim Ferriss, Naval Ravikant, and others began citing Stoic texts like instruction manuals for high-performance living. The idea was simple. In a world that moves fast, thinks shallow, and craves constant validation, Stoicism offers an antidote: stillness, control, clarity. Even mental health professionals took notice. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapies, PT, borrow heavily from Stoic principles. Challenge your thoughts. Focus on what you can control. Don't let emotion dictate action. Sound familiar? But the revival wasn't without criticism. Some said modern Stoicism had been stripped of its depth, turned into motivational wallpaper for productivity enthusiasts. And there is truth to that. Not every inspirational quote on Instagram reflects the rigor or the humility of the ancient practice. Still, the fact remains, Stoicism survived not because it was trendy, but because it works. When life goes sideways, when we lose a job, face a diagnosis, or wake up unsure of our place in the world, Stoicism reminds us, you can't control what happens, but you can control what you become. That message has never been more timely. And so, we arrive at the present, where ancient wisdom quietly guides modern minds. Today, Stoicism exists in a paradox. It is an ancient philosophy designed for inner peace, now living in a world obsessed with noise. Scroll through social media and you will see a quote from Marcus Aurelius sandwiched between cat videos and stock tips. Open a bestseller list and there it is, again a daily Stoic, waiting to be your morning mental vitamin. Somehow, a 2,300-year-old porch philosophy is trending. But Stoicism isn't popular because it's fashionable. It's popular because it addresses a very specific modern hunger: mental clarity in a world of confusion. When everything feels out of control, the economy, relationships, the climate, the algorithm, Stoicism offers a map inward. It teaches us to focus not on the chaos around us, but on the choices we still own. The central questions remain the same. What is in your control? What kind of person will you choose to be, regardless of circumstance, and unlike some philosophies that demand total withdrawal from the world, Stoicism invites us to participate. Go to work, raise your kids, serve your community, but do it from a place of calm. Not craving action, yes, but grounded action. In that sense, Stoicism is a kind of rebellion. Not the loud, sign-waving kind, but a silent resistance against impulsiveness, distraction, and emotional chaos. It is the discipline to pause before reacting, the courage to stay kind in a cruel moment, the humility to know you are not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for how you move through it. More than ever, people are returning to this simple clarity. Athletes use it to manage pressure. Veterans use it to process trauma. CEOs use it to lead without ego. Teenagers, overwhelmed by the constant flood of comparison and digital noise, turn to Epictetus for a lifeline. Of course, no philosophy is a magic cure. You will still feel grief. You will still fail. You will still lose your temper. But Stoicism gives you something rare, a framework to get back up, reflect, and re-enter. In the end, it is not about being perfect. It is about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that rewards loudness, maybe the most revolutionary act is to be still. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, statues of gods, and pools steaming in the morning sun. But to a Roman, it was just another Tuesday. Bathing wasn't an occasional treat. It was a daily ritual, and for many, an essential part of being Roman. By the height of the empire, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone, ranging from grand imperial complexes to modest neighborhood facilities. Everyone, from senators to shoemakers, made time to bathe. Cleanliness was important, yes, but so was the rhythm of the experience, the routine, the conversation, the heat. The process was deliberate. You would enter through the apodium, or changing room, where slaves might help wealthier patrons undress. From there, you would ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your pores and began the relaxation process. Then came the caldarium, the heart of the experience. A hot, steamy chamber heated by an underfloor system called the hypocaust. Here, bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with strigils curved metal, tools in, sometimes even get a massage. Finally, you would plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to tighten the skin and jolt the senses awake. It was this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill, that gave the ritual its power. Romans believed it was good for circulation, digestion, and even mood. And honestly, they were probably right. But more than hygiene or health, baths were about belonging. You went to see and be seen. You gossiped, worked, debated politics, made business deals, or just eavesdropped on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians, others brought snacks. Poets recited verses. Philosophers argued under domed ceilings, echoing with laughter and steam. In essence, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status mattered, but even emperors might share a room with commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were part of this daily world. For the Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about routine, health, society, and rhythm. A place where the individual dissolved just a bit into the larger hum of the empire, one breath of steam at a time. Roman baths weren't just impressive visually. They were engineering masterpieces. Long before the modern sauna or heated flooring, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, fire, and water into an immersive wellness center. At the core of this innovation was the hypocaust system, an early form of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves stoked a roaring furnace, known as the papyrus. It began with the fire, burning deep beneath the feet of the bathers, hidden away in the dark. This fire heated a hollow space beneath a raised floor, which was supported by small, sturdy columns of brick called pile. Hot air from the furnace flowed through this subfloor chamber and then rose up through hollow flues built directly into the walls, radiating heat through the room like a gentle stone oven. The result was a consistent, enveloping warmth of heat without smoke, which would otherwise suffocate the bathers. The architecture itself was strategic, designed to master the elements. Vaulted ceilings trapped the rising heat, while vast domes diffused the sound of splashing water and murmuring voices. A complex arrangement of rooms regulated the temperature flow, moving the bather seamlessly from the cooler apodidarium to the temperate tepidarium, and finally to the blazing heat of the caldarium. Windows were positioned perfectly to harness the afternoon sunlight, and the water was constantly circulating clean, flowing, and heated to exacting standards. And let us not forget the aqueducts, the silent stone heroes of the empire. These elevated channels delivered vast quantities of water into the cities from miles away, allowing even inland bath complexes to operate year-round. Some of the grandest baths, like those of the Emperor Caracalla or Diocletian, consumed millions of liters of water daily. Yet, the system was so well built that waste was minimal and the flow was constant. The water wasn't just used for soaking. Romans also had steam rooms, dry saunas, and even primitive flushing toilets nearby. Sewage was carried away through underground drainage systems again, all gravity-powered. The baths were not isolated marvels. They were integrated into the broader living infrastructure of Roman urban life. Maintenance was a constant, grueling reality. Workers known as fornicatores tended the roaring furnaces deep in the basements, while others cleaned the pools, managed vast supplies of wood, or repaired the intricate tiles and plumbing. It was labor-intensive work, but the reward was clear. These buildings didn't just last for years. Many stood strong for centuries, in an age with no electricity, no industrial machinery, and no digital thermostats. The Romans created a seamless experience of heat, comfort, and flow. That is why walking into a Roman bath wasn't just entering a building. It was entering a system, one powered by fire, sustained by water, and shaped by genius. Despite all the sweat, the steam, and the scraping of strigils, Roman baths were never just about physical cleansing. They were about information. In a society without smartphones, without email, and without newspapers, the baths functioned as a kind of open-air broadcast center. Gossip didn't just trickle here. It flowed. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets all mingled freely, with their togas off and their voices raised. Conversations carried across the tepidarium like wildfire. Who was sleeping with whom? What was the emperor plotting? Which general had just lost a battle in the east? Who bribed which magistrate to get out of paying their taxes? If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, or what might happen tomorrow, the bathhouse was the place to listen. This wasn't accidental. The Roman elite knew the baths were public arenas, and they used them strategically. Politics didn't stop at the Senate steps. Taves soaked right into the marble floors of the caldarium. A clever patrician might accidentally bump into a rival in the hot room and float a proposal under the haze of steam. Or perhaps a patron would meet a client to reaffirm loyalties, offer advice, or drop a veiled threat haul while lounging in the pool. Even emperors played the game. It is said that Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius made a point of visiting the public baths as an act of image control, appearing accessible, wise, and invested in the lives of ordinary citizens. Of course, they had private bath wings too, but showing up in the public zone was a statement. Kay said, "I am still one of you," sort of. It wasn't just politics that steamed up the tiles. Businessmen negotiated deals. Poets recited their latest lines to a captive audience. Ticked, philosophers debated ethics. The acoustics of the domed rooms often helped amplify voices, a useful trick for anyone who wanted their cleverness to be overheard. In a strange way, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Twitter, Wall Street, and the Senate floor all at once. It was unfiltered, buzzing, and deeply performative. But it was also where strategy was born. Real decisions, military, financial, personal, often started here, far from the formal halls of power. Because when everyone is half naked, sweating, and relaxed, the masks fall away. And in the steam, the real empire whispered its plans. To the Romans, bathing wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking polished, okay? It was a critical part of health and medicine, okay? The bathhouse was where ancient wellness philosophy met practical self-care. Doctors recommended it. Philosophers endorsed it. Even the military encouraged it. Hot water, cold plunges, sweating, and vigorous massages were all believed to purify the body and balance the humors. These were the four fluids the Romans thought governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow, bile, and black bile. If these got out of balance, you got sick. But a visit to the baths, with its cycle of heating, scraping, and cooling, could supposedly restore that delicate balance. And there is some logic to it, even by modern standards. The heat of the caldarium opened the pores, relaxed the muscles, and helped with circulation. The cold plunge in the frigidarium reduced inflammation and invigorated the senses. The skin was scraped clean with strigils, curved metal tools which removed dirt, oil, and dead skin. Afterward, many Romans received massages using scented oils, sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes just pure olive oil. Today, we might call this detoxing or hydrotherapy. They just called it daily life. Some of the larger bath complexes even included small medical clinics where physicians, often educated to examine patients, offered treatments, or suggested dietary changes if you had a persistent cough, aching joints, or digestive troubles. Many men played ball games in the exercise yards or palestra before beginning the bathing process. The idea was to work up a sweat before entering the steam rooms. Health wasn't passive. It was earned, one push-up and one plunge at a time. Even mental health wasn't ignored. It's the rhythm of the bath, its slow, deliberate transitions from room to room, encouraged reflection. Some Stoics and Epicureans even wrote about the baths as places to clear the mind and tame the emotions. In many ways, Roman baths were ahead of their time in an integrated space for exercise, cleansing, socializing, and healing. A kind of ancient wellness center, just with better mosaics and slightly more gossip. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't a goal. It was the foundation of virtue, clarity, and strength. And the bathhouse was where it all began. Walking into a grand Roman bathhouse wasn't just stepping into a building. It was stepping into an aesthetic experience. It's the architecture, the materials, the very air, Everything was designed to impress, to soothe, and to elevate the spirit. From the moment you entered the apodidium or changing room, you were surrounded by elegance. The walls were often painted in vivid frescoes depicting mythological scenes, rolling pastoral landscapes, or even cheeky caricatures of daily life. Marble benches lined the room, niches held clothing, and on the better days, musicians played softly in the background while your sandals were taken by a servant. Then came the baths themselves, okay? The tepidarium was usually the most beautiful room, designed as a kind of warm antechamber to the hotter and colder extremes. It was often circular or rectangular, with high, vaulted ceilings, colorful mosaics on the floors, and large windows that diffused the golden afternoon light. The ceilings were sometimes coffered or domed, supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone, creating a space that felt both intimate and immense. The caldarium, the hot room, was a place of sensory immersion. It featured heated pools and thick, rising steam that softened the edges of the room. But you would see bronze or terracotta braziers glowing softly, and sometimes gilded taps that float endlessly with heated water. Etiquette. The floors were warm beneath your feet, thanks to the ingenious hypocaust system working silently below. And the air itself seemed to shimmer with the heat. Decorative fountains and statues added a touch of divine elegance to the humidity. Apollo, Venus, and Hercules all made appearances, watching over the bathers through the mist. Then came the frigidarium, cool, serene, and usually the largest and most striking space in the complex. Its cold pool reflected a soaring ceiling, often covered in painted stars or intricate geometric patterns. The water itself glistened, sometimes lit by small skylights or open oculi that allowed a single beam of sunlight to cut through the mist and dance on the surface. There was a quiet stillness here, a sharp and welcome contrast to the chatter and the bustle of the warmer rooms. Everything in the Roman bath was designed to inspire awe. The use of imported marble, the colorful tile work, and the advanced geometry wasn't just vanity, it was a statement. The baths were the empire distilled into stone, orderly, refined, and proudly extravagant. Even smaller, local baths took design seriously. Mosaics often greeted bathers with humorous Latin phrases like cave canum, beware of the dog, or balneum gratum, meaning simply, the bath is pleasant. These were spaces meant to charm the eye, calm the spirit, and remind you, in case you have forgotten, that you were living in the greatest civilization on earth. And all of that before you even got wet. While Roman baths were public spaces, in theory, not all Romans experienced them equally. The bathhouse was a microcosm of Roman society, a place where lines blurred but never fully disappeared. Let us start with class. In the grand thermae of Rome, like those of Caracalla or Trajan, emperors might technically bathe in the same rooms as commoners. That sounds democratic, but social distinction still lingered in the air. The wealthy often arrived with entourages slaves to carry their towels, their oils, and even portable benches, so they never had to sit on cold stone. They could afford private massages or extra services in nearby rooms. Some larger baths even had exclusive sections, known as scali, reserved strictly for upper-class patrons. Even in the shared pools, there was an unspoken hierarchy. You might rub elbows with the senator, but you certainly weren't about to chat him up without an invitation. Then there was gender. Men and women did not usually bathe together. Most large bathhouses offered separate hours or entirely separate wings. Some emperors, like Hadrian, enforced strict segregation. Others, like Commodus or Elagabalus, allowed or even encouraged mixed bathing, much to the horror of conservative Roman moralists. Women's access depended heavily on time, location, and the whims of local officials. In wealthier cities, women had beautifully appointed baths of their own. In poorer regions, they often bathed early in the day, before the men arrived. While some women enjoyed regular access, others, particularly those of lower status, had to navigate schedules, scrutiny, and social stigma. Slaves and freedmen made up a significant portion of bath visitors. They were allowed in and often encouraged to attend, especially if their work was labor-intensive. However, they typically entered during off hours or utilized more modest facilities. That said, many slaves worked within the bathhouse as attendants, masseurs, or fire stokers, and some were known by name for their skill and their charm. And what about outsiders? Foreigners, non-citizens, and provincials were welcomed in most Roman cities, especially during the empire's heyday. In fact, the spread of Roman baths across conquered territories was one of the empire's most effective tools of cultural integration, a way of saying, "Welcome to Rome. Now, take your clothes off." So, yes, the Roman baths were a shared space. But just like in the Forum or the Senate, your experience depended heavily on who you were. Still, for a brief moment in the mist, between the hot stone and the splash of cold water, those lines could blur, and that was part of the magic. Though bathing was the central activity, Roman bathhouses were far more than places to get clean. They were entertainment, hubs, part gym, part theater, part loungewear. You could easily spend an entire afternoon, and many did. In fact, the larger bath complexes resembled ancient leisure centers. After a workout in the palestra courtyard used for wrestling, boxing, or ball games, you might take a stroll to the library, located just off the main hallway. Yes, many baths had libraries, so Romans could relax with scrolls by Cicero or Virgil, blending physical rejuvenation with intellectual stimulation. Healthy body and a healthy mind, both were on the menu. Music filled the air, too. So it wasn't uncommon to hear live performances from flutists, harpists, or singers echoing through the domed chambers. Bathers might be serenaded while reclining near a fountain or receiving an oil rub-down. Fact, some bathhouses employed professional entertainers to keep the mood light and luxurious, ranging from acrobats to comedians. There were also food stalls and snack counters, often located in or near the apoditerium, known as popane. These small eateries served wine, fresh bread, olives, cheese, and dried fruits. For wealthier patrons, personal slaves could bring more elaborate dishes and the occasional exotic treat from nearby villas. So, yes, you could technically eat grapes in the steam room like a decadent emperor, though etiquette varied. Gambling was common too. Dice games, betting on athletic matches, or just casual wagers among friends added an air of mischief to the setting. These activities weren't always strictly legal, but they were tolerated in bath culture. After all, people came here to let loose. The bathhouses also had spaces for intimate encounters. Some rooms functioned as private lounges, or even brothels, depending on the time and location. Morally ambiguous. Definitely. But Roman society had a much different view of public space, privacy, and sensuality than we do today. And the steamy, dimly lit atmosphere of the caldarium only added to the allure. One of Rome's most remarkable achievements wasn't just building an empire, it was standardizing the Roman experience across thousands of miles, and that included the baths. From the misty highlands of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, and from the forests of Gaul to the sands of Syria, the Roman bath became a unifying symbol of Roman identity. Wherever the legions marched and the engineers followed, they built roads, forts, and bathhouses. These provincial baths weren't just carbon copies. We reflected local resources and customs while still following the essential Roman layout. Apodium, tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium. In cold climates like Britain or Germania, the hot rooms were especially important and well insulated. In warmer places like North Africa or the Levant, some bathhouses expanded the shaded colonnades and cool pools, offering relief from the blistering sun. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jarouche in Jordan, and Bath in England all featured impressive thermae, often with mosaics, sculptures, and inscriptions celebrating imperial generosity. These weren't just public works, they were propaganda in stone. Every polished marble slab and steaming pool reminded the locals, this is Rome, and Rome takes care of its people. But the baths also played a critical role in cultural integration. For newly conquered peoples, the bathhouse served as a soft introduction to Roman customs. You might still speak your own language at home, but once you stripped off your clothes and stepped into the steam, you were participating in a Roman ritual, one that transcended ethnicity, origin, or local tribe. It also became a mark of urbanization. A city wasn't truly Roman until it had proper baths. They often came bundled with forums, amphitheaters, and temples, creating civic centers that mirrored those of the capital. Bathing, then, wasn't just about hygiene, it was about civilization. Of course, local twists remained. In Syria, baths sometimes incorporated Eastern architectural styles and mixed gender spaces. In Britain, Celtic traditions subtly influenced the bathing sequence. And in Egypt, older Hellenistic models blended with Roman designs to create hybrid complexes with lush courtyards and incense-filled air. No matter the local flavor, the Roman bath became a universal experience, one that made a vast empire feel strangely cohesive. It was a place where even at the farthest, wildest frontier, you could close your eyes in the caldarium, take a deep breath of steam, and for a moment, feel like you were right back in the heart of Rome. Like so much of Roman civilization, the glory of the baths didn't last forever. As the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th century CE, so too did the great bathhouses. What had once been daily rituals for millions of people slowly slipped into disrepair, abandonment, and eventually ruin. Several factors contributed to this slow decline. First, the empire's economy crumbled under the crushing weight of inflation, military overreach, and constant political instability. Funding the maintenance of vast bath complexes, which required entire teams of workers, constant fuel for the hypocaustes, and endless clean water from aqueducts became simply unsustainable. Then came the breakdown of infrastructure. Aqueducts, the lifelines of the baths, fell into neglect or were deliberately destroyed during invasions to cut off water supplies. Without running water, the baths lost their core purpose. The once bubbling caldariums went dry, and the marble halls echoed with a dusty silence. Religion also played a part, as Christianity became the dominant force in the empire. Public bathing, especially mixed or nude bathing, came under increasing moral scrutiny. Church leaders often saw the baths as symbols of pagan indulgence and bodily vanity, while some Christian emperors tried to preserve the public health function of the baths. Others shut them down or repurposed the grand structures into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. And yet, the legacy of Roman baths endured. In the Islamic world, the tradition continued through hammams, bathhouses that carried forward many Roman innovations, heated rooms, steam treatments, and communal cleansing rituals. These spread across the Middle East and North Africa, preserving the essence of Roman wellness within a new religious and cultural framework. In Europe, spas and mineral baths became popular again during the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. These revived bathing as a therapeutic and social activity, echoing the Roman model even as the empire itself was long gone. Today, the ruins of Roman baths still captivate visitors. It's the baths of Caracalla in Rome, the Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless smaller sites scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean remind us that Rome did unjust conquer through the sword. It conquered through comfort, engineering, and shared ritual. Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit lives on in our modern gyms, our spas, our hot showers, and our quiet moments of self-care. In a way, every time we draw a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we are channeling a bit of the empire. Steam rising, tension fading, time slowing, just as it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, medicine didn't live in a sterile laboratory. It lived in the temple, the home, and the world of the gods. Healing was not just a science, it was a spiritual art, and the person who treated your illness might just recite a spell while applying a poultice to your wound. That is because Egyptian medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Illness to them wasn't only about injury or infection. It could also be caused by the wrath of a god, the invasion of a malevolent spirit, or a disruption in mathocosmic order that governed all things. So, doctors, known as SNU, weren't always working alone. They often collaborated with priests who specialized in ritual and incantation. Together, they formed a dual force of treatment, one applying physical remedies, the other invoking divine protection. Temples were more than places of worship. They were centers of healing. Specific temples, like those dedicated to Imhotep the architect, physician, and later deified healers, served as proto-hospitals. People would sleep there in hopes of receiving divine dreams that revealed the source of their ailment or the cure itself. This was called incubation, and it was a respected method of diagnosis. Medical training was rigorous. Physicians studied scrolls like the Ebers papyrus and the Edwin Smith papyrus, which outlined hundreds of remedies, procedures, and case studies. These documents show that while the Egyptians invoked gods, they also keenly observed symptoms, recorded outcomes, and developed surprisingly advanced techniques ranging from wound suturing to dental care. But make no mistake, incantations were not just decorative. Many prescriptions included spells as essential ingredients. A broken bone might be treated with honey and linen splints, plus a recitation to ward off the evil spirits that caused the break. Psychological conditions, which we now recognize as mental illness, were seen as spiritual afflictions, often requiring the intervention of a priest or magician. To us, this fusion of medicine and mysticism might seem contradictory, but to the Egyptians, it was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were part of the same continuum. Healing one meant addressing all three. In the land of the Nile, to be a healer was to walk between two worlds, with one hand mixing herbs and the other raised toward the gods. Long before stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians relied on their senses and their experience. They became masters of visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, interpreting subtle signs in the body to understand what was wrong. Even if they believed the root cause might be spiritual, the first step in diagnosis was always careful observation. Physicians would examine a patient's posture, skin color, breath, hand, even urine or feces, to search for visible or olfactory clues. Was the swelling soft or hard? Did the discharge smell sweet or foul? These observations weren't just guesswork. They were documented, compared, and passed down through generations of healers. The pulse held particular significance. The Egyptians called it the speech of the heart. They believed that the heart was the center of a system of channels similar to a network of irrigation canals through which air, blood, and spirit flowed. If the pulse was irregular or weak, it suggested that one of these vital channels was blocked or disturbed. Although their anatomical understanding wasn't perfect, their conclusions often reflected real symptoms and led to logical treatments. Yet, when no physical explanation could be found, the physician would turn to spiritual causes. Was the illness a punishment from a god? A curse from an enemy? A lingering spirit refusing to leave the body? In such cases, diagnosis involved more than examination. It required consultation with a priest or magician, dream interpretation, or even astrological analysis. The alignment of stars and the behavior of sacred animals might factor into the final verdict. In texts like the Ebers papyrus, physicians categorized diseases based on patterns. They didn't always know why something happened, but they knew what usually followed. For instance, they could identify the stages of an infected wound or the course of a specific fever. These practical patterns formed the basis for treatment protocols. And interestingly, they were not always superstitious. Some medical texts explicitly separate physical ailments from spiritual ones. If a wound could be seen, smelled, and treated physically, no spell was required. But if all else failed, it was time to invoke divine aid. To an ancient Egyptian, the world was filled with unseen forces, careful hands, and centuries of accumulated wisdom. Their physicians sought to make the invisible visible. When it came to treatment, ancient Egyptian physicians had an astonishing arsenal of remedies and recipes. Their pharmacies weren't stocked with pills and injections, but with herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils, many of which they combined with surgical procedures and ritual chants. The result was a holistic approach that blended natural science with spiritual symbolism. At the heart of their medicine was the Ebers papyrus, a 1-100-N-10- page scroll from around 1550 BCE. It contains over 700 prescriptions addressing everything from stomach pain and toothaches to skin diseases and fertility issues. Each recipe was tailored not just to the disease, but to the patient's body and social status, and often included precise instructions for mixing, timing, and application. One of their favorite ingredients was honey, prized for its antimicrobial properties and, still used today in some wound care. Honey was applied to cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixed with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. They also used garlic, onion, juniper berries, and myrrh, not just for their strong aroma, but for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory effects. Their pharmacopoeia included more exotic fare as well: crocodile dung used for contraceptives, lizard blood for skin treatments, hippopotamus fat, and even mummified human flesh for particularly superstitious cures. To modern eyes, this may seem grotesque, but these remedies reflected their belief that the power of the ingredient lay not only in its physical properties, but also in its spiritual essence. The strength of the crocodile, the resilience of the lizard. Minerals like natron, a naturally occurring salt used in mummification, were also used to dry wounds, cleanse infections, and preserve bodies. Some were poetic, others aggressive. One charm for treating burns reads, "Oh, Isis, great magician, call upon you to cool the fire in the flesh of your servant, as you cooled the fire that scorched your own son, Horus." The spoken word was thought to imbue the remedy with divine power, turning simple herbs into miracles. Amulets were another form of protection and healing. People wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, the ankh, or the scarab beetle, each with deep symbolic significance. These amulets were believed to ward off evil, prevent disease, and protect both the living and the dead. Some were even embedded in bandages or placed directly on wounds to speed recovery. Specific deities were also invoked depending on the ailment. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plagues, was feared but also prayed to for healing. Thoth, the god of wisdom, was called upon to guide the hands of surgeons and scribes alike. In Egypt, medicine without magic was incomplete. The chant, the gesture, the symbol all were part of the cure. Because for the ancient Egyptians, healing didn't just mean removing pain. It meant restoring harmony between the body, the soul, and the cosmos itself. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end of life. It was the beginning of eternity. And to reach the afterlife, the body had to be preserved with absolute precision and care. Candle, the art of mummification, a practice that blurred the lines between medicine, magic, and mortuary science. At its core, mummification was about preserving the physical vessel so the soul could return to it in the afterlife. The body was seen as essential, not just a shell, but a sacred structure that the vital, spirit, and bad personality or soul needed to navigate the underworld and reunite in the next world. The process began shortly after death. Embalmers, who acted as both technicians and ritual specialists, washed the body with palm wine and water from the Nile. Then came the most critical step, the removal of the internal organs, which were quick to decay. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were extracted through an incision in the left side of the abdomen. They were then placed in separate canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The brain, curiously, was considered unimportant and was removed through the nose using metal hooks. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was often left in place, though in later periods, it too was removed and replaced with a sacred amulet shaped like a scarab. The empty body cavity was then stuffed with resins, myrrh, and linen to maintain its shape, and the entire body was covered in natrana, natural salt mixture, to dry it out completely. After 40 days, the body was washed again, anointed with precious oils, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, often with protective amulets placed between the folds. Each step was accompanied by spells, hymns, and rituals, particularly from the Book of the Dead. These invocations protected the deceased from demons and prepared them for judgment in the afterlife. The head embalmer often wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, to symbolize divine authority during the process. In many ways, mummification was the Egyptians' most advanced medical procedure, a blend of anatomy, chemistry, and spiritual engineering. It wasn't about saving a life in this world. It was about preserving it forever in the next. To them, the perfect body was more than a sign of health. It was a passport to eternity. And in every carefully wrapped limb, they practiced medicine for the soul. While temples and tombs held the secrets of Egypt's gods, papyrus scrolls held the secrets of its doctors. Ancient Egyptian medicine was far from a series of oral traditions or tribal remedies. It was a well-documented, professionalized system, and much of what we know comes from the surviving medical texts, written with surprising structure and care. The most famous of these is the Ebers papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, though it likely copied even older knowledge. Over 100 feet long, it contains more than 700 remedies for illnesses ranging from toothaches and stomach pains to mental disturbances and tumors. It includes detailed descriptions of symptoms, diagnosis, and treatments, often paired with spells or incantations. Another key text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a practical surgical manual written with clinical precision. Unlike other papyri filled with magic and prayers, this one reads like the notes of a battlefield doctor. It presents case studies of traumatic injuries, mostly fractures, dislocations, and head wounds, and outlines step by step how to examine, treat, and prognosticate. It is a rare glimpse into how Egyptians could separate spiritual belief from empirical observation when the situation demanded it. The Kahun Papyrus is another treasure, focused specifically on women's health, fertility, and gynecology. It provides insight into birth control methods, pregnancy, diagnosis, and even surgical procedures related to the uterus. These texts weren't hidden away. They were studied by scribes and physicians, many of whom trained at houses of life, scholarly institutions located within temple complexes. Here, medicine was taught alongside mathematics, astronomy, and religious law. Medical apprentices would copy texts by hand, memorize spells, and observe more experienced doctors at work. The Egyptians believed deeply in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Each scroll was a distillation of experience, observation, and divine insight, often attributed to gods like Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing. Physicians didn't just treat bodies, carried forward the knowledge of millennia. Interestingly, some Egyptian medical ideas made their way to Greece, especially through figures like Hippocrates and Galen, who studied Egyptian practices and praised their methods. Egypt's influence on classical medicine is undeniable. In an age where much of the world relied on superstition alone, Egypt gave us one of the first examples of recorded, repeatable, and structured medical science, written in ink, bound in papyrus, and passed on with purpose. Though the sands of time buried their temples and tombs, the legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine never truly disappeared. In fact, many of their practices, beliefs, and innovations quietly shaped the course of global medical history. Their echoes are still felt in today's hospitals, pharmacies, and spiritual healing traditions. First, their systematic approach to medicine was revolutionary. Akkadians categorized symptoms, recorded treatments, and made careful observations about cause and effect. They developed early ideas about diagnosis, prognosis, and hygiene centuries before the Greeks formalized such practices. Their emphasis on cleanliness, daily washing, antiseptic salves like honey and natron, and even the importance of bowel regularity prefigured modern public health long before the word existed. Their understanding of the mind-body connection was also ahead of its time. Though they didn't possess neuroscience, they recognized that psychological states could affect physical health. What they called spiritual affliction might today be recognized as depression, anxiety, or psychosomatic illness. And their combined treatments of herbs, rituals, and social support were surprisingly holistic. Even their use of herbal remedies has endured. Substances like garlic, castor oil, aloe vera, and willow barca, precursor to aspirin, are still used today. Some have been refined into modern drugs, while others are sold in health food stores as supplements. And while crocodile dung didn't make the cut, their experimentation with contraception laid early groundwork for reproductive medicine. But perhaps most enduring is their idea of the healer as both technician and guide. In Egypt, a physician wasn't just someone who closed wounds. They were someone who understood suffering. Healing was physical, emotional, and spiritual. That human-centered model has reemerged in modern holistic medicine, palliative care, and even psychotherapy. The fusion of medicine and magic might seem strange to us now, but it points to a truth that still holds. People don't just want to be cured. They want to be seen, comforted, and understood. Ancient Egyptian doctors knew this, and their scrolls, amulets, and incantations were not just treatments. They were acts of care. Their medicine wasn't perfect, but it was daring, structured, curious, and deeply human. Copper, known even then for its antimicrobial qualities, was sometimes crushed and painstakingly mixed into salves. Precious oils pressed from the lotus flower, castor beans, and black cumin were used for massage and pain relief, soothing the body and the spirit alike. Doses, of course, varied depending on the affliction. A prescription from that time might read something like this: mix crushed sycamore fruit, golden honey, and natron. Apply this to the wound for 4 days. And while you do so, recite the following spell over the mixture. You see, in Egypt, words were medicine too. The spoken charm was the spark that activated the cure, a reminder that for them, healing was as much about meaning and intention as it was about chemistry. Far from being primitive guesswork, Egyptian medicine was highly systematic, deeply documented, and refined over generations. While some remedies may sound bizarre to our modern ears, many were surprisingly effective, and some survive in spirit, or even in science, to this day. Their medicine chest was drawn from the land, the body, and the gods, and they reached into all three to heal. While much of ancient Egyptian medicine focused on herbs and incantations, the Egyptians were not afraid to cut when necessary. They understood that some ailments needed more than a poultice or a prayer. They needed a steady hand and a sharp blade. The best evidence we have of Egyptian surgery comes from the Edwin Smith papyrus, a medical text dating back 3,600 years, and it is unlike any other document from the ancient world. It is methodical, clinical, and strikingly modern in its tone. Describes 48 specific cases, mostly traumatic injuries, skull fractures, broken collarbones, and complex spinal wounds. Includes step-by-step instructions on examination, treatment, and prognosis. What is truly fascinating is how pragmatic the document is. It classifies every case into one of 3 outcomes: an ailment I will treat, ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. In other words, treatable, uncertain, and hopeless. This was triage, a concept of prioritizing care that we still use in emergency medicine today. Egyptian surgeons used a range of tools that would look somewhat familiar to a modern surgeon. They possessed bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, cautery hooks for sealing blood vessels, and needles. They practiced stitching wounds, draining abscesses, setting broken bones with wooden splints, and even performing circumcisions. Some mummies even show evidence of successful bone healing, indicating that patients survived their injuries and continued living for years afterward. They were also pioneers in wound hygiene. Before stitching a cut, a physician might cleanse it with honey, beer, or resinol, of which we now know have antiseptic properties. They then applied bandages soaked in oils or herbal mixtures to reduce inflammation and promote healing. Pain was eased with opium extracts or sedative herbs, though there is no evidence of true general anesthesia. Surgery was likely painful, but it was quick and precise. One striking detail reveals their wisdom. Egyptians often left foreign bodies, like embedded arrowheads, in place if removing them posed a greater risk of bleeding or infection. It shows a nuanced understanding of anatomy and risk management. They knew when to intervene, and crucially, they knew when not to. Of course, surgery had its limits. There is no record of internal operations or major amputations. They lacked the knowledge of circulation and infection the way we understand it today. But within the boundaries of what was possible, Egyptian surgeons were remarkably skilled. They didn't just experiment blindly. They observed, they recorded, and they passed their hard-won knowledge down. Through bandage and blade, Egypt laid the groundwork for practical, hands-on medicine. And centuries later, those lessons would echo through the halls of Greek, Roman, and modern surgical practice. In ancient Egypt, women's health was not a fringe concern. It was central to medical practice. Fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception were all treated with serious, dedicated attention. And women both received and sometimes practiced medical care themselves. One of the most fascinating sources on this topic is the Kahun gynecological papyrus. Dating to around 1800 BCE, it is the oldest known medical text focused entirely on women's reproductive health. The document includes diagnoses and treatments for infertility, miscarriage, vaginal discharge, and birth complications. And like other Egyptian texts, each entry follows a familiar rhythmic structure. The symptom, the examination, the diagnosis, and the treatment, sometimes purely medical, sometimes magical, and often a blend of both. For pregnancy, diagnosis began with clever experimentation. One common test involved having a woman urinate on barley and emmer wheat seeds over the course of several days. If the barley sprouted, she was said to be carrying a boy. If the emmer grew, a girl. If neither sprouted, she was not pregnant. Believe it or not, modern tests suggest this method may have had a modest accuracy, likely due to the hormone levels in the urine affecting seed germination. Contraceptives were another major area of focus. Ancient physicians used mixtures like honey, acacia leaves, and ground dates inserted as a kind of barrier method. Some recipes included crocodile dung, which sounds alarming to us, but was likely used for its sticky texture and its symbolic potency. These were primitive forms of spermicides and physical barriers aimed at preventing conception. During childbirth, midwives took the lead. They used birth bricks, decorated platforms on which the laboring woman squatted to allow gravity to assist, and offered both physical and spiritual support. Cantations were spoken to ward off the demon as Ammit, who was believed to cause miscarriages or birth complications. Protective amulets were essential, especially those depicting Tauret, the fierce but protective hippo goddess of childbirth. These amulets were worn to ensure a safe delivery. If labor was difficult, treatments ranged from massaging the womb with castor oil to having the mother breathe in herbal infusions or drink mixtures to stimulate the body's opening. Cesarean sections were unknown. The birth could not be completed naturally. Tragedy often followed. Still, much of Egyptian obstetrics was remarkably advanced for its time. It reflected a culture where fertility was divine, womanhood was sacred, and life itself was a process watched over by both healer and God. In the cradle of civilization, they respected the cradle of life with every chant, every herb, and every whispered hope. To modern minds, the blend of magic and medicine might seem contradictory, but in ancient Egypt, the two were inseparable. Healing the body meant treating the visible symptoms and the invisible forces. And sometimes, the cure came as much from a spoken word as from a poultice. The Egyptians believed that illness could be caused by many things: natural imbalances, bad food, or injury, certainly, but also by curses, malevolent spirits, or the will of angry gods. If you broke your leg in an accident, that was one thing. But if your stomach hurt for days with no visible cause, that might be a demon, or even the restless soul of the dead, known as an oki, trying to torment you. In these cases, physicians turned to Heka, the sacred power of magic. This was thought to have been given to humanity by the gods themselves to ward off the blows of fate. Heka wasn't a stage illusion or a parlor trick. It was a legitimate divine force, just as real to them as water, fire, or wind. A healer might use it to activate a remedy, to protect a wound from infection, or to drive out an invisible entity. Spells were often included in medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the London Medical Papyrus, written right alongside the surgical instructions.